Let's turn our attention now to the world of poker, maybe some investing lessons embedded in there. We're joined now by Maria Konnikova. She is the author of a new book, The Biggest Bluff, talking about her trajectory into the poker world under the guidance of a name, Maria, that I remember well from my youth, really getting into poker when that boom came up, Eric Seidel. And so I want to start with just a question, maybe for like a younger version of myself. Where's the poker world at right now? Because I remember Eric and Phil Hellmuth, Phil Ivey, Daniel Negreanu, all these guys from, I guess it was like the mid 2000s when that real boom came along. The game has changed a lot, but for the professional side of poker, what is the state of play there right now?
Well, prior to COVID, the state of poker was incredibly healthy. Last year was the biggest World Series of poker since the moneymaker boom. So it's been steadily growing. And the game has changed a lot. So a lot of the young pros are much more mathematical. So it's become a much more statistical game. You see Caltech PhDs at the poker table. People are using programs like solvers that will actually run simulations and tell you how to play hands. So that element has really been beefed up. But the Eric Seidels of the world, the Daniel Negreanu's, the Phil Hellmuths, they're all still around. Phil Ivey is playing again and is now mastering a new form of poker that didn't even exist back then, called short deck poker, where you play with fewer cards. And so the game is still alive and well. These days, it's now moving more and more online because live poker is not a thing, and we don't know when it will be. But it's kicking, and I have high hopes because people always say, "Oh, poker's dying. You know, game's getting too hard. No one's going to beat it anymore. There won't be any young blood." And look at me, I'm young blood.
Yeah, Maria, you're young blood and you're female blood. When you look at the set, and you talk about this quite a bit in your book, things. I think there was a section of the book where you talk about how you brought your puppy onto the screen, or there's a dog in there, and you kind of lean into the imagery of how people perceive women. Do you feel like that worked in your favor at all, so that people could underestimate you?
Absolutely. At first, it worked against me because I didn't know how to play as well, and I didn't know how to respond to the bullying and how to respond to the aggression. Poker's 97% male, and there's actually a lot of research that shows that men try to bluff women more. And if you tell them that they do that, they say, "No, I don't," and they'll just deny it to your face, even when presented with evidence that they do it. And at the beginning, it was hard for me because it was a new game. I was definitely an amateur. I had a major imposter syndrome, and deservedly so. I didn't know what I was doing. But then it became a huge asset because once I figured out what I was doing and once I worked out a strategy with my coach, I realized that being underestimated is amazing. I would love to be underestimated every single day of my life because you can take advantage of that. If people don't think you're capable of doing something, well, then you can do it that much more and get away with it. So if people don't think I'm capable of bluffing, if people don't think I'm capable of aggression unless I have a strong hand, then I can do that and I can get away with it. And I think that's a lesson that translates very well outside of the poker table.
And Maria, talking about lessons that translate well outside the poker table, in addition to the gender gap, you also talked about maybe the similar characteristics, I guess you can say, between traders and also gamblers and poker players. Talk about taking chances, the risk takers. I know poker requires a lot of skill, but you say that it requires more skill than investing in the stock market. So what do you mean by that? And what do you think are some skills that poker players can take and relate that to investing in the stock market?
Yeah, so I actually am not the one who said that. So I'm going to put those words back in the mouth of the person they came from, which is Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate, who studied poker players and studied professional investors and found that while professional investors thought they were playing poker, a skill game, so thought they were making decisions, making careful risk assessments, making judgments based on probabilities, making probabilistic assessments, and really judging based on the process, not the outcome, which is something that's crucially important in poker. You have to make the best decision you can, knowing that there's no such thing as making a sure thing decision, and you might still lose. You might be a 75% favorite. This is a risk that you always have to take, but 25% of the time you're going to fail, and that's okay. So he compared that to investors, and he found that investors who thought they were more like poker players were actually playing roulette or craps. They were actually just gambling. That's how poorly their performance correlated, unlike poker players where skill actually correlated from year to year. One of the problems is that investors weren't actually taking the feedback correctly. They weren't separating process from outcome. So when investments went down, they didn't want to keep losing, so they would sell losers, and they'd lock in the losses. When stocks went up, rather than figuring out, was my process correct? Do I need to hold on to this? They would actually hold on to them and try to get those gains rather than sell when they needed to sell. So basically they would just overtrade rather than doing what they should have been doing. And as Kahneman found out, they would have been better served not trading at all, just actually making no decisions and keeping their portfolio as is. They would have performed much better. I was surprised to see this, obviously, because when we think of investing, we think of it as a much more skilled occupation than poker, which we think of as a much more gambling occupation. Turns out not to be true. One of my favorite studies of poker showed, after analyzing hundreds of thousands of hands of online poker, that the best hand won on average 12% of the time. That means that the other 88% of the time, it was the best player that won.
Maria, Dan Roberts here. I'm just curious, a little bit of a twofold question for you. First of all, I report a lot on the daily fantasy sports industry, and there's a lot of overlap there. A lot of the people who were former, poker nuts, once DraftKings and FanDuel came along, they kind of merged over to that DFS world, and I see some overlap there. I'm curious your take on the explosion of that, especially amid the legalization of sports betting. And then a question that those people get a lot too, any thoughts on whether the stigma associated with gambling has changed or dissolved along with the change at the Supreme Court level, especially their concerns about addiction, et cetera? Thanks.
Yeah, so daily fantasy is definitely not my area, but it is the area of a lot of poker players, and I think there is a lot of overlap there. I think that sports betting has always been something that poker players have been into, and it's interesting that fantasy sports were always the first carved out exception on all those gambling statutes. UGIA, all of these laws that made online poker illegal, they always left a little loophole and said, oh, but daily fantasy sports are fine. So I'm guessing that there was someone drafting that legislature who was on board with the daily fantasy. And I do think that actually a lot of people have thought that it would be a step forward for poker legalization, that once people saw that the sports were going to happen, that poker would follow along. So far, that's not been the case. So far, we've seen the daily fantasy, but we haven't seen poker actually grow in more states. I hope the stigma goes away. I hope books like mine will actually make the stigma go away, because one of the things that I tried to show was that poker was not gambling, that lotteries are gambling, which are legal in all states and which are actually ways that states make money. But poker is not. Poker is a game of skill. And the easiest way to show that is in poker, I can win holding the worst hand, and I can lose with the best hand. If it were a gambling endeavor, that would not be the case. I'd have to have the best hand to win. And I think that poker is actually potentially even more skilled than daily fantasy. But unfortunately, regulators don't agree with me.
We'll see if they seems like there's a few slow converts, and maybe we'll get all 50 states on board with that sometime soon. All right, the book is called The Biggest Bluff. Maria Konnikova, thank you so much for joining the program. Congratulations on the book. Hopefully we can talk soon.
Hey investors, Zach Guzman here. Are you interested in learning more about the markets and getting the latest financial news? Well, then click right here to subscribe to our Yahoo Finance YouTube channel. Get the latest up-to-the-minute market analysis, big interviews in the world of finance, and information on how to manage your money every day wherever you are.